This is the first of 3 videos that you'll be able to watch that will give you an introduction into the React development environment. So let's just take a look at what I'm showing here. Here's the reactjs.org website. You don't actually use this site to download React. I'll show you how to do that. It's from a command line. Here's documents, kind of basically all the information you need to know about the concepts and how the API works, and then a tutorial. So the first video that I'm going to go over with you in this video is basically the introduction into what React is. The second video will give you a little bit more in-depth usage of it, and then the third video will show you an application I wrote called Newswatcher and how it works. So React, what is it? I call it a framework. Some people don't like to say it's a framework. Basically, ultimately, it's a JavaScript file that gets run in the browser through a script command, and it contains, the React framework itself as well as your code bundled together that then represents that. So how do you program in React? What is it? We'll get into that in detail, and we'll show you a project built from scratch. But basically, it's JavaScript in a file mixed with HTML markup. So instead of just writing an HTML file and having the browser show that, you write JavaScript and HTML alongside. And now, obviously then, with the JavaScript, you get the power of deciding what renders. So you can have control logic in your JavaScript, if-else statements, for example. You can have looping, all the power of the JavaScript language to then help you put together what HTML you want to show. Now, there's also something called React Native. So the regular React information we're going to show you here is for building browser websites. There's also something called React Native, which is very simple. And with that, you can write most of the same type of JavaScript, HTML elements, and you can expose that as a native application in iOS and Android. I'm not going to go over any of the competing frameworks, but you can understand that there's obviously many other popular frameworks, Angular, Vue, JS, and others that have come along and that are still popular. I really enjoy, as a JavaScript developer, really the power of React and how it works. Now, the one thing about React that's different than Angular is very opinionated. It's very controlling. And so everything that you do in the application is built into Angular. Whereas React has taken a different approach where it gives you the basic ability to put together an application, but then you get to bolt on and pull in other packages and modules and code to then fill it out and decide which ones you like the best, like for state management or making HTTP calls for network access. Now, basically, it all comes down then to using React as you do with any type of these frameworks to control what's called the document object model, the DOM, the elements that are actually in your browser. And if you've done programming in the past, perhaps you've heard of jQuery and used it. That no longer is needed with a framework such as React. Perhaps the best way to start with introducing you to React is just to step back a minute and let's just look at a simple HTML file, and then we'll see how we can duplicate this in a React application. So here is a simple file. It's got a header, body, and an H1 element that says hello world. So if we were to open this up in the browser, which I've done here, it says hello world. And again, we can see the same source that we set for it here. Now, how do we do that in a React application? How is that different? As I said, you're still going to have the elements and whatnot, and you'll see that we have an H1 element, but it's a little bit different how it gets put together. There's a lot more to it. But once you get past that initial complexity, then it's just writing, again, like you're used to writing some HTML. But the great thing is you get to combine that with JavaScript to control how the HTML is displayed and rendered. Before we can actually run the command that creates our React application, you need to have Node installed on your computer. Here is the nodejs.org website. And you can see if you go to the home page, it actually lists the downloads. And I'm on a Mac, so it's telling me I can download for the Mac OS. Now there's two buttons here, one for long-term support, LTS, and the other for the current. So don't install the current. That's like the latest development branch. What you want is a long-term support branch. We're currently at 16. So click on that, get that installed. So that'll install actually two things. It'll install Node, so you have the Node command prompt, command that you can actually type to run a Node application. But importantly, also as important, is it installs something called NPM, Node Package Manager. And that's what we'll actually be using to then create our React application. Once you've got that installed, we can then go to our command prompt, and we can type the command to create a React application. You could do all that this command is going to do by hand, but it would be quite an undertaking to get all the other packages installed that are required to actually build and run a React application. So the command is going to be npx create React app. So npx is kind of like an npm command, but it doesn't actually, you could install, in other words, install the create React app on your machine with an npm install command. But what we're going to do is npx is a way to run a package without actually having it on your machine, because you won't need it after this. So npx create React app, and then just give it some name. We'll just call it my app, and then let that run, and it will create a directory, my app. In this case, I have a temp directory, and I'm creating my React application under my app. So we'll speed ahead, and we'll jump ahead, and we'll see what we need to do from this point once it's created, so we won't waste our time here watching the install happen. All right, now that that's all set up, we can change directories to go to my app. Oops. And we're going to open up Visual Studio Code, and we'll take a look at the files that have been created. The first file we'll look at then is the package.json. This shows you the NPM packages that were installed as part of this application, this JavaScript application. And let's just look at the most important one here, React. So we see we've installed the React NPM package. It's version 18.1. And then there's some other things that have been installed along with it, React DOM and React scripts. And then these three lines here are for testing. We're not going to cover that in this video, but that will be important to understand as it uses Jest, and we can also use something called React Test Library to test our application. Now there's some scripts here, and we'll make use of these. So one of them we'll shortly be able to see is how we can run our React application. So we'll run the start React script, and we'll also see that we can build it and test it. And eject is if you want to, it's a more complicated thing to go into, but it's if you want to take control of your application outside of the create React app steps, so that you can do further changes to it that are more complex, that aren't handled. So that's basically that. There's linting also, so that you can catch any JavaScript errors. Okay, so that's the first file we want to look at. Let's look at just a few other files here. So the source directory is important, and one important file is index.js. This is where we can kind of look for the beginning code that React uses, and this is kind of standard, and mostly will stay the same as you alter other files in your code. So we see some imports happening. We have React being imported and some other things, and this is an important one. So app is basically where is going to be the starting point for your code where you're going to put everything. So basically what you're going to do, this is boilerplate code. You won't have to change it as I mentioned. This code is looking, so this is some just straight browser JavaScript code. So it's saying, I want to look in my HTML in the DOM and I want to find an element named root. It's going to get that, and then React's going to take it from there. It's going to find that, and then it's going to run some React code to then render your application. Now, if we actually jump up to the index.html, which is going to be used basically as the starting point for our application, you can see that indeed there is a div and it has an ID of root. So that is kind of interesting that that is what it's finding, and then everything gets injected at that point, and React can put all the HTML code and run all your code to do the rendering. So let's then go look at the app. Okay, so this is an interesting file. So this is really right now it's got some boilerplate code that it put in there, and we're going to want to alter that so it says hello world. What we're going to replace then is basically this code here. We're going to put in our h1 element again. That will display the text, hello world. We'll save that, and then you can see I've got the command ready, npm run start, just to refresh your memory. If you do npm run, then you can give it one of these commands and it will run them. So right now we're going to do the start command, and we're going to go back here. And there we have it, hello world. Now if we look at the page source, it's not what we expected, is it? Or maybe not what you expected. And so this is one of the things with a React application, is that React is rendering it, and so the source that you're going to see isn't necessarily what you would see like with our straight HTML file. So here it is, here's the source, and it goes back to that file that we saw. So React is actually taking this, and its code then is replacing that div that has an ID of root, and it knows how to then take our code that we said we wanted, which was that h1 element that says hello world. Let's go back to the code, play around with it a little bit, and I'll show you some JavaScript that's mixed in with the HTML. So instead of just returning the simple h1 element, let's do something like this. So we have a variable, and this variable again could be calculated somewhere, passed in, or we could go to a web service call, HTTP call, get a value, and then we could then do something with that value. So let's pretend we're getting that name from somewhere, and if it has a value, then we're going to use it. If it doesn't, then we're going to display hello world. So we'll save that off, and right now it's set to null, so we would expect to get our same hello world that we got before, and that's correct. Now let's go back to the code, and this time it's going to give it a value. Say hello Jeff. All right, now we can save that, run it again. This time we get hello Jeff. Let's make one more modification just to illustrate something. All right, so here we have the typical, developer usage console log statement. Not really something you'd use in an enterprise application. You'd have some kind of central logging capability, but in this case it works for us, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. So let's go back and we'll stop that. Get that to run again. Okay, hello Jeff. Now let's look at the developer tools. So if you go in Chrome to developer tools, or you can hit F12, at least I can on my Mac. Let's see what we can see with developer tools. Now this is a little bit different. When we viewed the source, we didn't really get to see much here. But now we actually get to see it after it's rendered. So we can actually look at the DOM and we can see, oh, there it is. There's the element. Hello, Jeff. If you go to console, you can see, print statements. This is our console.log statement coming out where we looked at what the variable Jeff had in it. Now here's something interesting. So we can click on sources and you can see that we can traverse our location and we can find our files. That's great. So what if we put a break statement on this, refreshed it? Now, this is very handy. You can debug your code, and if something's not showing up right, you can say, oh, I wonder what that variable is. And it may be what you expected or what you didn't expect. And you can see you can step into or step over the code, and then if you hit here, you can, or F8, you can resume the execution, and then the whole thing runs and gets around your breakpoint. So you can add or remove breakpoints. Very handy. So you'll probably want to use this a lot to debug. This is the only way you can debug your code. You can also debug it as well in Visual Studio, or sorry, in VS Code. I find it just as handy though to do this in the browser developer tools, because you can look at the console and the elements. You can even look at the network calls that are going on. There's some performance capabilities you can look at. So we'll get into that later in another video. There are some subtle differences in the HTML. So let's take a look at that. First one to notice here, I didn't point it out when I put it there, but the curly braces. You can put curly braces in certain places, and then that signifies to React that you're actually running some JavaScript in there. So in other words, here, the value of name is being put in place. So whatever that is, it gets replaced here. And if it says Jeff, for example, then that's why we had Jeff show up there. Let me just replace this real quick. So the point is, you can have any kind of elements or tags that you normally use in HTML, and you can return those. So here's an image tag. Now, there are some differences here, like the attributes or the properties of a tag. Always use camel case. So tab index, normally in HTML it's lowercase, and in React it needs to be camel case, so capital I there. Instead of class, it has to be class name. And then here's another example of using the curly braces. So if this were a URL to an image and we ran this, then it would actually, show that image there. We don't actually have the CSS for image class, so I'm not going to do it. But those are some of the differences. So just be aware that some things have changed, but it holds pretty true to standard HTML. Let's talk about components. So we saw in our code, right, we had this function called app that was a component. We call it a functional component. Now it's highly unlikely that you would be able to place all of your UI rendering code in one file. You would split it out. You would have navigation to one screen or another, and even on a given screen, you'd have multiple sections on that screen that might be rendered individually, and in those sections you'd have controls that are rendered. So this is what you do in React, is you break it down into components, and each component is basically a file, and that file contains the code just for that little piece. It could even just be as simple as a button, and that individual button is what is being rendered in that component file. So let's take a look at something I've done now to the JavaScript code in the app.js. Here we have the file altered. We still have this function app, which is, again, as I mentioned, it's a functional component. And that is what this file is pulling in and then using to render. When React initially came out, it basically looked like this. We called this a component class, and we basically derived or extended React.component. It's still used. I don't know that it'll be deprecated anytime soon. A lot of people don't like to do that anymore, and I'll give some examples. It's a little bit more complicated than this. If you use what's called a component class, there's something that you also have to learn about lifecycle events. And so there's other functions that you can override, like when rendering happens or after rendering, and you have to worry about these lifecycle events. With the function components, you don't have those lifecycle events, but you have what's called hooks. And we'll get into that later, what that is. So here's the same basic idea that we have this. It's kind of like our hello world, but this time it's greetings. So we have 4 different ways that we're doing this. We have 1 that's the component class and 3 that are functions. So the other thing that I'm also going to explain, but I'm jumping ahead of myself, is the ability to have these properties or attributes on a class and pass in values, and those are then used in the class rendering, and we can get at them through what we call properties. So properties are passed in, and you can have any number, 1 or more, or none if you don't want any. So here with our class derivation, if you know anything about class programming, right, there's always this that you reference. And then off of that, we have the properties, and then we have the name. So the use looks all the same down below. We have greetings 1, greetings 2, 3, and 4. And we have name, and we have Joe, Mary, Paul, and Sally. Now let's look at the next one. So these next 3 are functional components. And you can see that we can pass in and receive props. And so we can say props.name, and we get the name. Here's an arrow function usage. So this is not using an arrow function. So this is an arrow function, just showing you a different way to, JavaScript allows you to write your functions as an arrow function. Here's another look at the arrow function, but instead of, taking props.name, we basically transfer in JavaScript syntax the value from props into name, and now we have the name as a variable that we can use. So we can run it, and we can see what we expect here. Yeah. And so each of the different properties that are passed in are now displayed. Now I've simplified the file down just to have the functional component. It's called greeting here. And what I was telling you before is that the properties are immutable, meaning they can't be changed. You can read them, but you can't alter them. So this line is going to be the suspect here. We won't be allowed to actually do this. So we're passing in Paul, but we can't later then in the functional component for greeting, we can't change that to Jim. And we'll see that if we attempt to run that, that will be denied. Now, we don't see anything here. That's because we need to go to the console log output where we'll see the error. It tells us that it's a read-only property, not allowed to be altered. Components can also maintain internal state. So this is where you get to have variables that can hold the data about what's going on within that component. And it may be something that doesn't need to be exposed outside or above that component. So any changes to that can also be used in variables in your elements, for example, in the curly braces, to then expose something that is an internal state. It changes and then it updates and reflects in the UI. So let's look at minor modification here. So here's where we've set up a local variable called local name. And instead of hard coding it with double quotes here for Paul, we set it up to use a local variable. Now this is not going to work. I'm going to explain why. This is not the way that React is set up to be used. Mainly because you can see that React really won't know about this JavaScript set timeout. It certainly knows at render time that this local variable called local name contains Paul, and it can put that up. However, when this set timeout fires, it changes that variable, which is allowed, but React isn't going to know that it changed, and so it's not going to change to John. So let's run that, and we'll see that it'll say Paul. And if we wait 5 seconds, it's not going to say John ever. And there's no message either, right? There's no console message or any kind of error that's happening. As I explained, it's because it didn't know that had changed. So let's see how to do that in React the proper way. React has what are called hooks. There's several different names for these hooks. This is called the useState hook. And what that allows you to do is set up the syntax where it understands that you create the name of a local variable, the name of a function that you want to then call if you ever want to alter that. And then you call the useState hook, and you get to give it an initial value. So we're setting it to Paul like we wanted before. This time we can call this special function that React is going to know about at this point. And when we call it and set the name to John, React's going to know about it, and it's going to go through another refresh cycle. And React's very smart about it as well. So if you have a lot of these hooks that are being called to change the state at the same time, it may batch them up, and then it's smart about what part of the UI it needs to refresh and not be constantly refreshing the UI. So let's run this again, and we'll see that it starts out Paul, and then 3 seconds later it will change to John. Okay, so that's pretty clear. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but the syntax, once you see it and use it several times, you'll see how it works very well. And that's how you can keep internal state. And here we're using a timer to actually change to John, but there may be some other interactions in the UI that can also use this set local name. And so you can call it from, interactions. For example, if you had a text box and you had it as an input text box and you entered the name and then clicked some button, or even as the characters were being typed in, it could be changing that local variable. Now, the additional information I want to make sure that you understood as we look at this example again is that this value right here can be more complex. It could actually be an object, for example. And so it could be something like this. And we could close that off, and it can contain an age, 6, something like that. And so when you alter it in the set, you would obviously have to alter it accordingly. It also gives you the ability in this set to get what the previous value was and then use that to help you modify the next value. So that's important to realize that it can be a string or an object or an array or anything you want. Be complex as you need in your code. Now, the other thing to look at here is that, let me set this back to the way it was. So this was, local state. This was the internal state using the useState. So to this app functional component, right, it's using this as a local state. which goes to then illustrate, which is an important point to also note, is that that is being passed in as a property. And so if a change ever happens in the parent, that property changes and it knows to then refresh the greetings component. So React, again, is super smart about knowing who's changing what and where it's changing. And so here you see a mix of local state with properties. But even though this is a property, it's getting updated because the parent local state was changing, if you understand what I'm saying on that. And the last thing I guess I can say about state. So we talked about, a parent having a state, a child having a state, and they can flow back and forth. And I'll actually show you an example where a child can actually have something flow back to the parent, and the parent can get like an event notification that something was clicked in a child. But let's think about this. So you also perhaps need have a case and a need for like some kind of global state that's above everything. So in this case, the advice is put the values at the highest point where they can be used across children. But there's some cases where, let's say you have one child that has a state and another child who knows where it is in the hierarchy. You don't want to be concerned about that. It also needs to know about that state. So for example, let's say you have a login token and all the pages and all the different components may need that token to then access something on a web services call. You may have lots of different things then that could exist in some kind of a central state. So React has this concept of a central state as well, and you can put things in that central state and then you can access it anywhere else. So you can read and you can write from that state all over your app and not be confused about, okay, where is it? It's just in a central location. There's a very popular module or package that you can download and include in your app, and that's called Redux. And Redux is very popular. I like to use it, and it was created before React really had the same capability. But I still find that right now Redux is a little bit more powerful, maybe a little bit more complex, and we're not going to go into how to use it at this point, but in a later video we'll see how you can use that for keeping track of global state. To finish off on this video, we've been running the script command start. We're now going to actually do an official build, which then will create a deployable package that you could host either on the back end of a web server, or you could put it up into say on S3 and AWS or CloudFront to be served up as a static web page that then can load the SPA single page application. So we're going to run the build command. So if we go to our command prompt again, npm run build, that's going to create a build folder for us. So this newly appeared. And what you would serve up then is the index.html file, and then it would get access to things like what's in the static files and whatnot. So here's basically some JavaScript that's served up. Now if we looked at this, we can get this to format better. There. Now if you look at that, we've got the same, what we saw before. It's very similar to the index.html file we saw before. This one's in the build directory, however, and it is a little bit different. It's got this line on it. Oh, sorry, wrong line. This line. So this is the script then. That is the main JavaScript running that's been packed and built, and now it's available to then run. So it needs to be able to reference that from a static directory. There's one other modification you have to make if we go back to the package.json. So since it thinks it's going to be running it from a server, it's going to try and find that directory at the root. So we have to basically put this simple little line in here in our package.json to say, hey, this is a little bit unusual. Find the static directory right from, right off the same main root directory. So let's go and double click on Okay, here's my app. We got the build directory, and we got the index.html file. And there we have it. The same thing is going to render that we saw before, but this time from the officially built files for you to deploy and distribute. So that wraps up the first of the 3 videos on React. So I encourage you to watch for the other 2, and like I said, we'll go into more depth on some of the syntax of React, on how to use it in the second one, and the third one will be based on a project out of a book that I published, and that will be the Newswatcher application.